Now, let's turn to the key figure here, and that's Martin Luther himself. He's a medieval man who bridges culture to the modern world, and he played the most critical and crucial role in the Reformation in the early years, beginning in 1517 with the famous nailing of his 95 Theses to the Wittenberg church door on October the 31st. Now, many other leaders participated in the Protestant Reformation, and there are like Ulrich Zwingli, for example, Melanchthon, which was Luther's collaborator, and other theologians in attempts to reform the church had failed for over 2 centuries prior to Luther. There had been mystics, a lot of mystics, German mystics, Italian mystics, and so forth, who were trying to turn the church back towards a spiritual focus, away from so much politics and power and money, and towards its true spiritual mission. Those mystics did not succeed in reforming the church, but they did influence Luther. Luther himself had been influenced by a great deal of mysticism. Then there was a conciliar movement. This was an attempt to take the whole leadership of the church and put it in the hands of a council instead of the papacy. This failed as well, primarily because 2 separate conciliar movements formed, and they both competed with each other and canceled each other out. And so that failed. There were also biblical reformers who preceded Luther, people who were pointing to the Scriptures and saying we need to focus on the Scripture and derive our beliefs from that. This would be Wycliffe and Huss. Neither of these two could correct those problems. Huss was martyred, and Wycliffe was driven into exile. And so neither one of them could reform the church either. Now, on the eve of October the 31st, 1517, Luther had penned 95 Theses, essentially 95 tweet-length little statements about indulgences. Now, each one of these was a sharp blow against the perceived abuse of selling indulgences. And someone took it down, or at least the story goes, someone took it down and had it printed up, and then all of a sudden it went viral. Within 2 weeks, all of Germany had it, and within a couple of months, all of Europe had read his 95 Theses. Now, this basically meant that his ideas are going to split Europe wide open, and the world would be forever changed, and a lot of steep consequences are going to occur in politics, religion, and culture, and society. Even wars would ensue from these 95 Theses and the subsequent writings that Luther had produced. Now, past critiques of the Roman Catholic Church had fizzled out, but Luther, at this opportune moment, hit the bullseye with perfect timing. Now, Luther had no intent that this would occur. He had no idea that it would occur. It just did. It was a spark, and it basically set the world on fire. So let us understand a little bit about the background story of this cataclysmic event. All right, so now we're going to take a look at Luther's fascinating life story. You really cannot understand Luther's theology or the Protestant Reformation without understanding Luther's life. I mean, his life and his theology intertwine. It's almost like his life is his theology in a sense. Unlike a lot of other theologians, say Aquinas or others, you don't really need to know much at all about Aquinas' life to understand his theology. But with Luther, it all intertwines and mixes, okay? So, entire bookshelves can be filled with studies on his life and thought, if not entire libraries. Of course, this is the 500th year anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, and there's been a huge flurry of activity in the scholarly world and in the cultural world on his life, all kinds of documentaries and et cetera, movies even, okay? So he was born in 1483 into a very stern and hardworking family of copper smelters. This was a family that was hoping to rise up through the ranks of society from a working class family to kind of being a middle class family. And Luther was the primary hope. And so they were fueling his education with money and providing the way for him to rise up with upward mobility. And so he had a very good education as he was being raised, and his father had high hopes for him. And it's part of the story, because at some point he will decide to become a monk instead of a lawyer like his father had hoped, and that will bring about a great deal of disappointment. But at university, he thoroughly absorbed the nominalist view of theology. That is, that God is completely omnipotent. No one can have any power because God has all power. Okay, omni means all, and potent is power. If God is all powerful, then that means no one else has any power. And God has made everything as a special creation. And so there are no forms, there are no Platonic forms or anything like we saw. So he's a thoroughgoing nominalist, and many people at his university, professors and others, taught this nominalist view. And so this dark conception of God is also going to lead to his spiritual struggle. You really do not know if you have pleased God, and God is no man's debtor, as Occam said, and therefore you don't know if you have ever pleased God. You don't know that you have ever attained salvation. And so there is a principle called the facientibus doctrine. It says, facientibus quod ense est Deus non denegat gratiam. If you do what you can, God will not deny grace. But how do you know that you have done what you can? And Luther was always second-guessing himself. He never knew that he had done enough to attain his salvation. Now, you have to understand that this time period in history, people are very, very interested in their salvation. Death is all around. I mean, plague strikes every time you look up almost. I mean, it's a common occurrence in his world. Wars, famines, diseases. And so it isn't a world that is as stable as ours. And so death is all around, and people are very much concerned about what their eternal destiny is. And so Luther is caught up in this kind of a spiritual struggle. He thought that he could never do enough, and he could never know if he was saved and he was going to go to heaven. He thought that one's best efforts will not make God save you. It will not ensure it. And so nobody had any idea of this idea or this notion of salvation by grace, or sola gratia at this point. For example, what was commonly believed amongst Roman Catholics and in Rome at that time was that justification unto salvation was going to be completely different. It is completely different from what Protestants think. Protestants will come to believe in an imputed obedience of Christ as the ground for justification. But the Roman Catholic Church followed the idea of the facientibus doctrine. That is, if you do what you can, God won't deny you grace. Okay? And so what does imputed obedience of Christ mean? It means that the righteousness of Christ is completely transferred over to you instantaneously. Now, if I can give you an idea of what imputed means as opposed to the imparted righteousness of Christ, which is what the facientibus doctrine held. If I was to say to you, hey, I'm going to give you your entire life salary today. I'm going to write you a check, or in fact, I'm going to make an electronic transfer right now into your account. Let's just suppose we've calculated up your entire life salary is going to be $5 million. And so I just impute it over to you and immediately deposit into your account. Now you've got your whole life salary already in your bank account. That would be like imputed salvation. It's given to you all at once. Imparted righteousness means that it comes to you little bit, kind of the way your paycheck does now. Okay? It's given to you in little pieces throughout your life. You never know, and you're always living kind of hand to mouth, you never know if you've ever attained any kind of righteousness. You're just getting little parts of it. Okay? So this is going to be one of Luther's great shifts, and in fact it will be to this very day a kind of centerpiece of Protestant and evangelical thought, and that is that that the righteousness of Christ is imputed to the believer. Okay, salvation, and this comes through faith. Okay, faith is the moment in which that is imputed to you. So let's go back into some of the events of his life. On July the 2nd, 1505, with his master's degree in hand, he was returning from home, and he was going back to the university town where he graduated from. He was caught in a thunderstorm at night. And this fierce electrical storm was throwing lightning bolts all around. And one of these lightning bolts fell within mere feet of his path and just really shocked the daylights out of him. He fell to the ground and he prayed to a saint, Saint Anne, who was the patron saint of miners and travelers. And he told Saint Anne, he said, "If you will save me, I will become a monk." And so that vow is something that he fulfilled in his life. She did save him, or at least he thought so, and so he did become a monk. That lightning bolt electrified far more than Luther, and it would soon electrify the whole world and set it on fire, because now Luther is going to join a monastery and become a monk. He joins the Augustinian order of hermits, a very strict order of monks that follow the Augustinian theology. Much to the chagrin of his father, who had high hopes and high cost for his son's career as a lawyer. Now his young lawyer son is going to go off and become a monk. And so you can imagine the family's disappointment with his decision. But Luther hoped to find spiritual peace and to also find assurance of his salvation. He had followed the Facientibus doctrine, and even as a monk, he's laboring under this idea that if he does what he can, maybe God will save him. That's the whole idea of the Facientibus. God is not obligated to save you. He might, he may not, you don't know, you just try your best, and if he does, good for you. If he doesn't, you have no arguments. There's no way that you can appeal your case, so to speak. And so he labored very hard as an ascetic. What is an ascetic? Asceticism, not to be confused with aesthetics, which means the study of beauty or something like that, but an ascetic is someone who pursues a life of extreme vigor and extreme, often pain. Some of the ascetics would whip themselves daily with a whip to flagellate their back, to bring pain. And so an ascetic is someone who lives a very austere life of simple food, of very simple dress, and often not even sleeping for a full night's rest. Luther would even sleep out in the snow without a cover in order to try to burn out of his soul all fleshly comforts. The thought is that if you punish your flesh constantly and you deny your flesh, that eventually your spirit will be liberated from the chains, the prison of your fleshly life. Through all of this, Luther is pursuing his salvation, trying to earn it, and he fears God's deep wrath. He fears that he has this image of a very wrathful God. Now, at this time, his caring mentor, Johannes von Staupitz, directs Luther to stop thinking about God's wrath and to start focusing on the Scriptures. And Luther had never even studied the Scriptures at this point. It was not a normal course of study and one that he had never done. So, in his relentless quest for reconciliation to God and studying the Scripture, eventually several passages become pivotal for his understanding, and these are going to change the whole world of Christian theology. Two passages that are quite critical for Luther are Romans 1:16 and 17 and Galatians 3:6. These gave him new insights into his quest. Romans 1:16 says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. For as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith, just as Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness." This is where Luther gets the notion and the idea, it hits him between the eyes, that justification comes from faith. In 1515, these ideas are becoming quite vivid in his understanding. These and other passages unlock for him the Pauline teachings that an individual's justification and reconciliation with God come through that person's faith, not from the ascetic works, not from all the hard labor, not from following a bunch of rituals. that are mediated through priests and through institutions. And it's also at this time that he begins to reject the humanist agenda of the Renaissance. In other words, he begins to reject all those humanist ideas that we saw, for example, in Pico de Mirandola. The human beings can, through their free will, ascend to angelic type of nature. Justification by faith so liberated and captured Luther that it became the very core not only of his thought but of all subsequent Protestant thought, and it's one of its most enduring theological concepts. Around 1515, Luther begins to criticize the then universally accepted idea that salvation slowly accrues to a person through continual participation in all types of practices, sacraments, and rituals, and so forth. Because he's already discovered, that justification hits you like that lightning bolt, and that it's an instantaneous imputation of righteousness to you. For Luther, the grace of justification is a lightning bolt imputed by faith alone. So in the months leading up until October the 31st, 1517, when he puts those 95 Theses on the door of the church, a very fateful financial transaction and political transaction occurred between Pope Leo X and Albert of Mainz. As fate would have it, Luther's life struggle will soon collide with some of the primary gears driving geopolitics at that time. He never intended, nor could he have known, that these cataclysmic events would unfold. What Albert of Mainz wanted was to be the Archbishop of Mainz, but he was already the Archbishop of Magdeburg, and you couldn't be Archbishop of two different places at the same time, unless the Pope let you. And so, Albert came up with an idea, of course, to get this second archbishopric. This would be almost like being the mayor of two large cities at the same time. Okay, we probably don't see that in our day and age. Say somebody, mayor of New York City and also mayor of Chicago. Okay, it just doesn't happen. But that's what Albert wanted. So desiring both these archbishoprics, Albert came up with an idea. He was going to pay Leo X an enormous sum of borrowed gold. Now, Albert was broke, but he was a very influential person, and so he came up with a way to borrow the money. And there's a very kind of subtle deal that was worked out here, a kind of a high finance deal between him, Leo X, and the Fuggersbank. Leo required a lot of money to finish his prize project, which was the Basilica of St. Peter's, a very expensive project. And Albert offered him an enormous amount of gold that he borrowed from the Fuggersbank, and he struck a unique bargain with him. Leo agreed to issue a special indulgence to be sold to people throughout the Holy Roman Empire by a man named Johann Tetzel. Half of the money raised by Tetzel would go to repay the loan. So Albert would repay his loan to the Fuggersbank with the sale of this indulgence. The other half of the money would go straight to the Pope himself. So the Pope not only gets money from selling the archbishopric, but also from the sale of the indulgences. Now, Tetzel began preaching the sale of indulgences. What is an indulgence? It is long a part of Roman Catholic Church. The Pope can issue a special act of forgiveness or remission of sin to the person who purchases the indulgence. Okay? In this case, one could buy forgiveness of sin even for a deceased loved one who is suffering in purgatory. Tetzel excelled in selling these spiritual treasures, creating jingles such as, "When a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs." The idea being that if you were to purchase this little special indulgence, a piece of paper, an official document, if you will, from the Pope or from Tetzel, who was the agent of the Pope, then this piece of paper, this document, ensured that your loved one who had just died or died in recent years would be sprung from purgatory. And so the person would not be in purgatory anymore suffering and would go straight to paradise. You could also buy one for yourself. And so this was buying salvation, if you will. Now, to Luther, this idea that salvation could be marketed and sold and transacted with a gold coin went contrary to everything that he had just discovered in Scriptures and everything that Paul had taught about faith and salvation and about the imputed righteousness of Christ and so forth. So Tetzel came to a town nearby Luther, and Luther learned about it. Luther never actually went to hear Tetzel preach, but he understood what Tetzel was doing. And he was very disturbed at what Tetzel was doing in selling these indulgences to people even within his own parish. And Luther decided to pen these 95 theses against the indulgences. And it was thought to simply be a set of theses that he would then go dispute with other theologians and other learned doctors of the university there at Wittenberg. But a dizzying sequence of escalating events led to his ideas, his 95 theses, spreading throughout Germany and eventually throughout Europe. Like I said, it was like a spark that set a wildfire. And these dizzying sequence of events would eventually lead to Luther's excommunication and his trial at the Diet of Worms, where he was found guilty of violating official church dogma. So his translation of the Bible into the German for the first time, and it will ultimately lead even to the peasant rebellions. And this was a kind of a very, very dark time for the Protestant Reformation when these peasants rebelled in Germany. It would also lead ultimately to Lutheranism and the Augsburg Confession, and very much a great deal of religious and political turmoil in Europe that would eventually result in the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648. So enormous events are going to unfold from this event in 1517.